Okay, as I understand, I came here at the end of Hardy's presentation, but I didn't hear the whole thing. But what I believe he was talking about was about forming the movement. And so, after forming a movement, the next thing is that now when you have it, when you form the movement, now you have to sustain it until victory. So Hardy and I are going to talk about that today. I'm going to spend some time first explaining the kind of broad aspects of sustaining a movement as a concept, and Hardy is going to go into some detail later. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation, so I would like to apologize first to Al Giordano and to others who used to quote me because I used to say that all power corrupts, but PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So, and here I am using a PowerPoint. So, but it's just a light PowerPoint. I
remember the question last night about whether any Serbian revolutionaries later sold out.
Exactly. So this is an example of that. So let's see what does sustaining a movement mean and how does that work. I don't know if there are people here who studied natural sciences, especially physics or thermodynamics. And so what I have here is an equivalent of the two laws of thermodynamics, and I call them the laws of movement dynamics. And the first law of movement dynamics says the less time you spend and less effort you spend in forming the movement, when you design the movement, when you set up the basic structure, manifesto, and the decision-making rules, and how you recruit, what's your vision of tomorrow, what's your unifying proposition, all these elements at the beginning, the less time you spend there, the less effort you spend there, the more effort you're going to spend later keeping the movement together, sustaining it, defending it against external threats, etc., etc. So this is what I call the first law of movement dynamics, which is the less effort spent in forming the movement means more effort spent in sustaining the movement. Well, that actually means that the more effort you spend at the beginning, that means the less effort you're going to spend in sustaining the movement, which means ideally, if you spend the infinite amount of effort at the very beginning, the movement will sustain itself. It will have the capacity to run on its own. You don't need, as a leader or as a leadership of the movement, to spend any effort at all. Unfortunately, there is the second law of movement dynamics, and that says that, whatever effort you are going to spend is more than the effort you expected. And so even if you make this ideal movement, some things are going to go wrong. And then you're going to have more effort trying to keep it together. So what does this mean? This means that, yes, it is important to plan ahead. It is important to put all the things in order beforehand and to try to front load the strategy and to try to establish all the possible responses to all the possible risks and threats that are out there. But even when you do that, there is going to still be certain uncertainties, to put it like that. And then you're going to be overwhelmed with what is coming anyway. So, as Winston Churchill said, planning is everything, plan is nothing. So the plan that you create in the planning phase will eventually be obsolete if something unexpected comes up, and something unexpected is going to come up. So what does this mean? This means that as you design the movement, and Hardy talked about it yesterday, and when you go through all the steps at the very beginning in forming the movement, in the movement design, you will still have to, as you go, you will have to do certain adjustments and to make certain decisions and to do certain things in order to keep the movement going. And so what do you do? What are the things you have to pay attention to? Because there are going to be all these things, all the information coming, and you're going to be overwhelmed with the information both from different branches of the movement, from the enemy or from the adversary, from potential allies, and you have to pay attention to what is really important and what is just noise that needs to be disregarded. So what helps here is the three key factors, or I don't know how Hardy calls them, the three.
Principles of success.
Three. There you have some word.
Trifecta.
Trifecta of exactly. Trifecta of success. So these three key factors, they don't necessarily mean that if you have all three that you're going to succeed, but if you have two or one. And not all of them, that is a certain sign of failure. So let me go briefly through each of those factors. These factors actually are important, that when you have the movement running and when you're having a movement involved in the middle of a campaign, you can always assess the movement against these three factors and to see where you are in regards to these three factors. Because these three factors are going to determine the success of the movement. The first factor is unity. And this unity means not just the unity of organization, but the unity of goals, the unity of ideas, and the unity of action. That means that the movement is a unified front. That means that all the internal divisions and all the internal disputes and splits are put aside and they don't threaten the goals of the movement. And so as you go as the movement progresses in its struggle, it can always check against this factor to see if the unity is strengthened or did some cracks started to appear. And it is important to mend those cracks. So this is the first factor. Why is this unity important? The unity of the movement is important in the same way that the cracks in the regime are important. We want to see disunity. We want to see discord on the adversary side, but we also, want to see the unified front on our side. So that eventually, it exists on different levels. The unity of ideas, the unity of goals, the unity of organization. But what it eventually comes down to in reality and how it plays out is the unity of action. And what you have with a broad-based movement that has this unity of action, you have a nationwide series of tactics and actions that are perfectly coordinated, although they're not run from the same center. And we're going to go into that in a minute. And that is what makes a movement, how should I say, unified in action. And this is how you can assess it relatively easily. You just see how things are playing out in reality after everything. So this brings us to the second thing, which is planning. And as I said, planning is everything and plan is nothing. Planning as a factor doesn't mean that you have to have the perfect plan, which is the master key. These are the steps that we're going to take, and these steps are going to bring us closer to victory, and eventually we're gonna be victorious because we have the plan. And as long as we stick to this plan, we're fine. No, it doesn't work like that because certain things happen that nobody expects. But planning as a capability or planning as a capacity of the movement is what is important. That means that at all levels, both the national level, let's say the leadership of the movement, as well as regional and local levels, the local branches and regional committees of the movement, they all have the planning capacity, which means that they can assess the situation, they can distinguish important facts from unimportant noise, they can process the important facts and prepare responses to them, and check those against the grand strategy of the movement. What are the goals, and are we going to be closer to those goals than before? So if unexpected things happen, national level, regional level, or local level, or even an individual that is part of the movement can prepare a plan as a response to that. And that's why planning is everything and plan is nothing. Because the plans are going to be devised and they're going to be produced as a result of new opportunities that arise or new threats that occur. And something unexpected happens, you need to be, as a movement, you need to be quick in in making a plan how to respond to that. The third key factor is nonviolent discipline. And traditionally, it's nonviolent discipline. I always stress discipline over nonviolent discipline. And, because I kind of try to say the movement needs to be disciplined in everything, not just in sticking to nonviolence. But essentially what nonviolent discipline means is that the movement needs to maintain its nonviolent discipline in order to prevent clashes with the adversary and with the pillars of support of that adversary, mainly the police, the army, and other security forces. Because if there is a conflict between these two, between the movement and the pillars of support of the regime, then the dynamic of the conflict changes completely. The dynamic of the conflict then becomes what we can say that the members of the security forces think they're not fighting because they were ordered to, but they're fighting because they were under attack. And that's why it changes completely the dynamic. And that's why maintaining this nonviolent discipline is important. Why? Because you have a broad-based movement that is operating all over the country. And you can't really control them. So they have to, how shall I say, show restraint on their own from resorting to violence. And when they're left alone and when they're in a serious or difficult situation and if they're threatened by repression, they need to find the way out without resorting to violence. But as I say, I like to stress discipline because this discipline has to spread out from the nonviolent discipline. The movement needs to be disciplined in general. Members of the movement need to stick to the line of the movement. This is important because of the message discipline. It's important because when the movement operates in such a large scale, it's very difficult to coordinate different things in different parts of the movement. So it is important that each part of the movement sticks to their part of the plan, and they stick to what was agreed on. So because there is nobody to control them and to put them back on the right track. So one more few more minutes to spend on that. How do these three factors play out in reality? What are the different areas of the movement, sustaining the movement or movement development over time, where you're going to see these factors and play out, and why are they important? First, let's focus at mobilizing and recruiting. I mean, every movement needs to recruit new members. Isn't that correct? It's more members means more capacity to do action. But if you look at the recruiting and mobilizing effort through the factors of unity, planning, and nonviolent discipline, what comes out as a result is actually the question, how fast do we need to grow? Which means how fast the movement can actually accept new recruits. If you grow too fast, is this going to hinder nonviolent discipline? How does this going to affect the unity of the movement? Are we going to bring in people that are not still, how shall I say, they fully didn't digest the movement's message and all that stuff? So are we going to bring in different groups that are later going to start fighting with each other? So with nonviolent discipline and with if we bring too many people at the same time, are we going to be able to guarantee that they are not going to resort to violence? And so when you look at that through the perspective of three key factors, then when you plan your recruitment campaign and when you plan how many people you want to recruit, I tell you, you're going to be more modest. And then you're going to be saying, well, in the first 3 months, we're not going to grow that fast. We're going to go with a few hundred people and that's it. Why? Because we can't handle more. But later, if we develop the capacity, we could. Well, decision-making structure, or decision-making process in the loose structure as the movement is. You need to you need to think about it. And instead of just borrowing certain how shall I say? Instead of borrowing certain decision-making models that were developed by other organizations, if you check through the three key factors like unity, planning, and nonviolent discipline, then the decision-making process needs to be designed to fully strengthen these three key factors. Decision-making in a broad-based movement means that you have to have, let's say, a movement of a few 100,000 people where everybody will have their say. But how is that going to be affecting unity and the planning capacity and nonviolent discipline? So what is the right way to do it? I'll tell you how we did it. For instance, in Serbia with Otpor, we realized that we cannot have an inclusive democracy, because because the movement was so big, and people couldn't participate in the decision-making process because it was technically impossible to bring them together. And the second thing was, we were operating under repression as a declared terrorist organization, so it wasn't even safe for them to come together and to do any voting or deliberations or any of that kind. So our how shall I say? Our decision was not to have voting at all and not to have decision-making on the national level at all, but rather to have a federalized structure of the movement with the broad local autonomy of each branch. So each branch would actually pretty much operate on its own, just having in mind that, we need to follow the grand strategy and the basic goals of getting rid of Milosevic through elections that are going to be followed by the campaign of civil disobedience. But apart from that, they were totally on their own. Why? Because freedom of action was there to compensate for the lack of how shall I say, lack of involvement in decision making at the national level, because that was impossible. So these are and as a result, we increased unity because people felt that they have an influence on the movement, if not on the national level, but at least they had pretty big influence on the local level what the movement was doing, and they kind of controlled they did the planning on their own on the local level. They developed that capacity, and they also maintained their own nonviolent discipline. So that was our how shall I say, solution to this problem. Some other movements may have some other solutions, but it is an important problem, because you want to have people included in the movement, which means they need to, voice their grievances through the movement. That means they need to be represented in one way or another in the decision-making process. So then the third thing is external threats, mostly repression, but also other threats that come up. And so unity planning and nonviolent discipline here also help us understand how we're going to deal with that. What is our capacity to sustain the threat of or the blow of repression? People that we mobilized and recruited earlier, do they have the capacity to have that response? I mean, you saw in the movie last night when Serja explains about, when an activist was arrested, we had like people coming out and sending a press release, sending lawyers to the police station, going to the police station. You have to develop that capacity in order to deal with repression. But there is also the problem of internal weaknesses, which are the divisions and sometimes ideological, sometimes personal, sometimes regional, sometimes, ethnic, whatever. There are going to be problems inside the movement, and you need to, spend some effort trying to keep the movement together in that. And this also is tied to decision-making structure. If the decision-making structure is such that people feel misrepresented, you're going to have more of this discord inside. So this also needs to be checked against, the unity planning and nonviolent discipline. And this one actually is mostly correlated to unity as a key factor. It's actually the opposite of unity. And then, there is another aspect of the movement. When do you declare victory? That is also important because, especially when it comes to planning, and at one point you will have to say we won, but that the moment when you say we won is not necessarily the moment when you're perfectly happy with the outcome, and usually you're not perfectly happy with the outcome, but there is a moment where you will have to change the mode of action, where this form of movement will no longer be the most effective way, and that we'll have to transform it into something more. There is also, I mentioned that last night. There is also a moment where there is an opportunity for members of the movement to join the government. And that, as I said, works both ways. They change the institutions they enter, but the institutions change them. So, there are these questions, and they're usually answered in a different way. But if we use the three key factors, unity planning and nonviolent discipline to think when are we going to declare victory. That means, look at the plan and what are the goals and how close we are to those goals. Maybe we reached them, maybe we didn't reach them, but it's okay to declare victory. Maybe we got even more than that. And how does that have an effect on the unity of the movement? Do we have, because of some certain event that is coming, do we have a potential of big split in the movement that we can only prevent by declaring victory before that split happens? That's also a thought to have. So, and I can list more because any problem that you face when you run a movement can be checked against these three factors. And what is good about them is that they kind of give you a litmus test on is the movement going in the right direction or not. Do you have more unity in the movement than before? Do you have the planning capacity and an operational plan for the next period? And what is the level of discipline, especially nonviolent discipline, in the movement? And you can check that at every stage of the struggle. So I'm gonna hand it over to Hardy.
Okay. First, I want to just say something general about sustaining a movement. Every movement, this sounds obvious, but every movement has to sustain itself. Now, you'd think by looking at commentators about Egypt that movement started on January 25th and declared victory and ended on February 11th. And when a movement thinks that it can get a quick victory like this, that it can suddenly form and get a quick victory like this, it can lead to a great deal of disappointment. Because every time a revolution starts, there's always a counter-revolution trying to push it back. So even if a movement appears to get a quick victory, even if a movement seems like, oh my gosh, it's moving so quickly, there will always come a phase where there is a setback, and the movement will have to switch from thinking about trying to get a quick victory into a long-term struggle. I know of no movement that follows a different pattern than this. And so you frequently see a movement, if they're lucky, they will get a quick victory, but there will always be setbacks. And this is the sustaining period. And this is a different psychology than this. So movements have to shift their whole psychology, shift their expectations, regardless of whether they seem to get a quick victory or, in the case of some movements, they get a quick upsurge, lots of repression, and then still need to organize themselves. Like, for example, the Green Movement in Iran, you could say, followed this without a quick victory, but still, now they have to play for the long term. So just a couple things. I want to talk about the relationship between a movement's vision, its campaigns, and its tactics, and then I want to go particularly into tactics. So just, have people seen this diagram before? So this is one way that we can understand, it's a model. No model's perfect. But it's a model for understanding the relationship between a movement's vision, its campaigns, and its tactics. And this is actually drawn from military strategy. So what we have here, movement's vision at the top. So for Otpor wanted a democratic and free Serbia. Then they had campaigns. One campaign was called Gotov je, he's finished, designed to delegitimize Milosevic. They had a get out the vote campaign as well. They had a campaign to recruit and train people. They had a campaign to support those who were arrested. So a campaign, as we said yesterday, is a broad phase of a struggle for a particular objective, and then there are particular tactics that were used in each campaign. We see this in the civil rights movement as well. Great. If you have any questions, just shout them out. Now, ideally, your tactics or movement's tactics will support its campaigns directly, and then the campaigns will support the movement's vision. And this means that all the energy ultimately gets concentrated towards a clear and concrete vision of what the movement wants. And generally speaking, at least if you follow this model, the place to start planning is generally with vision. What do we want to achieve? Then down to what are the major phases of that achievement, of how that achievement will happen, and then what are the particular actions we'll take to support that. Now, is this, in your experience, how activists plan? Do they think along the lines of this triangle? No. So how do activists plan in your experience? From the bottom up. What are the advantages or limitations of planning from the bottom up?
You get lost.
You get lost.
Waste time.
You get to direct action instead of like Ivan was talking about all the planning phase, that if you spend some more time planning, you'll sustain the movement. Usually what happens is the other way around. Usually is you go to the action first, and it's usually very pressing and you need to do it right away. So then you get the other problems of getting lost along the way. And
Or you did an action and then lots of people got arrested and suddenly you have to figure out what to do about that, and then suddenly you're reacting. So if you're not careful, people, a movement may become this. It may become that if you're not careful. And we've seen lots of movements like that. Lots and lots of movements like that. And now, one of my inspirations, Sun Tzu, writing, 500 BC, great military strategist, said, this is from what Jack put in his presentation as well, strategy without tactics is the noise before defeat. Okay?
Yeah.
That, yes. As I said, I work on these right until the moment I go up, and sometimes I'm a little tired. So anyway, you get the idea. Okay, remember, plan is nothing. Okay, let's see. Okay, I want to talk now about tactical innovation. There are lots and lots of considerations and factors that a movement may need to think about when it's planning tactics. What's the objective of the tactic? Who's the tactic targeted at? Who's going to carry out the tactic? What are the logistical supports needed? All these different variables. What's the follow-up plan after the tactic? What comes next? What came before? All of this is very relevant. I will speak to some of that now. Can somebody tell me why tactical innovation may be important in sustaining a movement?
Okay, you have to find the right tactic for the right sort of like the audience and the sort of like supporters that you have.
Right.
That's, in that sense, you have to be innovative because some of the tech that are used in a different movement may not apply into your environment and people that you have, the skills that you have. So I think that's what innovation.
Tactical creativity, absolutely. Got it?
For security and protection, it catches the other side by surprise.
Catch the other side by surprise. So a military strategist that Gene Sharp was inspired by was Sir Basil Littleheart, who had a phrase, distract and dislocate. If a movement is able to initiate tactics quickly, its adversary will be reactive and will constantly be off balance, unable to come together and form a plan. Yeah, what else?
There needs to be an element of surprise all the time, because I come from India where protests are so common. And if you're going to ask them to come for a fast or sit-in or you have to do these things, people say, oh, you don't have any other job, you just keep doing the same things, but there are no outcomes. So if you're constantly innovative, and in most of the protests, we make sure that there is a very large amount of time devoted to innovation. New things always keep coming up. Then that is easy to gather attention as well. And you do what the police are exactly not expecting you to do. That's...
Yeah, there can be a great advantage to that. But then the counterpoint, of course, is someone like Gandhi who says, my strength is in saying exactly what I'm going to do, and I'm still going to win, and we're not going to have secrecy in this movement, because then, there are strategic advantages to not having secrecy in some cases, but then that's not a counter to your point, Ashok. That's a complement to your point, depending on the situation. Absolutely, surprise can be critical. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Because your opponents, they also study from their mistakes. And the modern dictators, they already know how Slobo failed. They also study nonviolent struggle, and so the method that's useful yesterday, today they won't function.
So the opponents learn. And that's a great point. And one of the things that I say is that there is a science to waging nonviolent struggle, but there is no formula to waging nonviolent struggle. I cannot tell anyone, if you do A, B, C, D, and E, you will get G or F, right? In your situation. Every situation's different. Opponents are constantly learning. There are principles, and Ivan discussed some of those, that work across a lot of different struggles. The application of those principles is specific to every situation, so there is no formula. But strategy is not just a science, it's also an art, and the art is in the application. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I think also tactical innovation keeps people engaged in a way that it creates its own political space for that engagement, and so that's one of the reasons why it's so important is to keep it fresh and to keep, to find the political space to allow more and more people to engage.
So, for example, no disrespect, for example, to Amnesty International, but when I remember when they started their letter writing campaigns in the 1980s, it was like a big deal that Amnesty was doing this. And now when people think about Amnesty's letter writing campaigns, it doesn't get quite the same press coverage or level of excitement. New tactics are needed sometimes to keep the excitement going. Okay, one other comment. Al.
I'd say that there is a formula. And that never repeat a tactic. If a tactic works the first time, never repeat it. That's the formula.
It's the anti-formula. Yes, great. Thank you, Al. Thank you. So you guys were great. You guys got a lot of what I wanted to say there. Effective tactics are often innovative. You can repeat a tactic, but repeating it in a different place, in a different manner, different way, so that functionally it's a different tactic. I mean, you can do a protest in two different spots, but doing a protest in different ways at different times. Some protest may be a rapid mobilization real quick, and then a rapid demobilization. Another one might be really, really slow and long and multiple days. So switching up the time, place, manner, who's doing it, all these different variables can lead to different outcomes. And here, for those of you who, like Ivan, think mathematically and like graphs, I have a very academic graph for you all to talk about how this relates to sustaining a movement. So this graph is by a great writer and thinker on social movements, Doug McAdam. And this is from a 1983 article in American Sociological Review entitled Tactical Innovation in the Pace of Insurgency. And what McAdam did is he looked at a period of the U.S. civil rights movement, okay? And this solid black line, he looked at newspaper reports, solid black line, which is at the top, most portions of it, is total movement activity at a given time, okay? And then underneath that, he has different sort of dotted lines. If you look at this part of the graph, September 1955, January 56, you'll see that dotted line underneath. that represents activity that was a bus boycott. Okay, great. So here, this is the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks. And then we see people continue to do bus boycotts slowly over time, and then less and less and less. Presumably because the tactic has lost effectiveness, the tolerance of the adversaries has increased for it, or they're getting better at countering it. If their tolerance is increasing for it, that's not a bad thing necessarily. That means, okay, buses are starting to get integrated perhaps. And it starts trailing off. This, who is the troublemaker who did this spike in 1960 in Nashville? Look at that. It dwarfs the rest of the movement in terms of activity. This dotted line represents Nashville and other sit-ins like Greensboro, North Carolina is another one? Greensboro. Yeah, Greensboro. And others starting in January 1960. Look at that. Look at what sit-ins did, a new tactic for this movement in terms of movement activity. Bam. Huge spike. And it continues, goes on, trails off. What's this? This is the Freedom Rides, new tactic, new spike in activity. Okay? Then we have what McAdam terms of community actions. This is campaign in Albany, Georgia, Selma. Actions which were designed to escalate even further this struggle and have communities take on segregation in a variety of forms in that given community. So what we see in terms of sustaining a movement is that new innovations and tactics contribute enormously to the movement being durable, the movement continuing. Do people have questions about that? Did I explain that okay? I've never had to explain that. Yeah.
I think it's interesting too, in terms of this idea of also building a movement and not thinking that it's just going to happen all in 5 minutes. That you're going to get to that spike without first having the campaign that can build the unified vision, planning, and discipline.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is the number of sittings that were on the left hand, like 5, 10, 20.
You'd have to, I can share the article with people, but
It isn't.
yeah, it's not the number of sit-ins. What McAdam was looking at was articles written. So he was doing a correlation of articles written with movement activity. So as in any quantitative study, there is, a difference between exactly what they're looking at and what's actually happening on the ground.
Because I think if he took the numbers of people involved in a given tactic, I think he would also find an interesting correlation in terms of recruitment and mobilization once the new tactics were implemented.
Yeah.
If he was at it.
That's a good point. Jim, what did you want to say?
Yeah. One of the reasons bus boycotts ended is because buses desegregated. They hired black people in various capacities, or they went out of business. So it didn't just fade away. It was a successful strategy that spread. It spread entirely. The other thing is that newspapers, especially in the South, did not cover it. So this is a very poor business. We did not have a press that, as we do, as even today, that is prepared to report the news locally or otherwise under various circumstances. So articles did not get printed. I mean, a major newspaper in Nashville, Tennessee reported. Not the Nashville Banner refused to say anything about the movement in Nashville.
Well, I will have
You can't find anything in that big urban paper. Huh? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And the other thing about it is that the study of the sit-in campaign in 1960-61 has not been researched. But I do know, as a student and strategist working, it went into every single state. It was the first, in a sense, national campaign. There were activities on universities across the country, activities by community civic groups across the country, support activities, and then new local activities based upon their own examination of their own situation. So it's a massive, no one has really researched that.
Yeah. Well, and actually, I just noticed while you were speaking, Jim, it appears Doug's only source, and I don't want to, I wish, I had the article committed to memory so then I could talk about his methodology, but it appears here he was using the New York Times. So there could have been, his data, if that's the case, his data would be only as good as the New York Times. Yeah. Yeah.
Working during the war in Sri Lanka, the last phase of the war, I was there.
Yeah.
And trying to organize people, sending out messages. If you look at the Sri Lankan mainstream newspapers, you would find hardly any mention about the sufferings and the bombings that were actually taking place inside the no-war zone. There's nothing. The Western world did not even know that was happening because the Sri Lankan diplomacy was so good that they went around saying we are only counter-attacking inside the no-fire zone.
Yes.
Now, being in that area, working in the relief camps over there, I know for sure that the hospitals were being bombed 18 times a day. Constantly being bombed. And now, of course, we have information. But then, what happens with media is, media itself loses interest when you're reporting the same thing again and again and again. It's kind of, media gets fatigued. It gets tired. People don't want to look at it anymore. So, but that doesn't mean the people have lost interest in the movement itself. They are doing what they have to do and continuously doing. So, this kind of analysis gives me a little difficulty in saying, okay, the media, yes, reports certain things, but the law in India we have no big national media. For them, 50 kilometers outside Delhi does not exist. India is not there.
Well, Ashok, I don't disagree with anything you said. It's just that, and we'll talk to a quantitative researcher later, Erica Chenoweth, who's here, who can probably answer the ins and outs of using media coverage and the pros and cons of using it. But as a quantitative researcher, you have to find something that is numerical and countable. All your points, I think, are totally valid, and I'm sure Doug would agree with them as well. It ain't perfect, but here's sort of a correlation we can find. But yeah, absolutely. Point well taken. Okay, we have a half an hour. I want to go on a little bit further and then open it up for Q&A. Is that good? So now, how can movements come up with tactical innovations? There are a lot of different ways, but I want to provide an exercise for people to think about, either when they're looking at other movements, because I know you're not all necessarily actively in movements, but maybe covering or looking to work with movements in your capacity as journalists or members of civil society, or some of you who may be activists and may be thinking about new tactics. So I'm going to introduce a tool called tactical mapping. Okay, and this I believe was developed by an organization called New Tactics in Human Rights, which has done a great job publicizing this tool. And, pardon? New Tactics in Human Rights. I can post a really great article about this, actually. I will do that. And if I forget, remind me. Okay? So, let's say you have a corporation, okay? And let's say that corporation is like a mine. It's an extractive corporation, okay? So you have a copper mine, for example, okay? What are the relationships that corporation needs in order to function? What does it need? What kinds of relationships does it need? For example, it needs workers to work. What else does it need in order to function? It needs investors. Great. It needs consumers, customers. What else? It needs security, pardon? A business idea, sure, yeah. It needs, strategic thinkers, management. What else? Pardon? Lawyers, yes. Always good to have an army of lawyers on your side, right? And have them write the laws and then get them passed. It's even better, yeah? Marketing, they need, right. Okay, huh? Local government support. There's a big one you guys aren't getting yet. They need raw materials. They need transportation. They need materials coming in. They need refined product or raw materials going out. Transportation's huge. Okay? So I'm going to show you an example from history of tactical innovation that follows this sort of model. Okay? Now, you guys know I'm a big fan of the United Farm Workers. Again, that's a union started in California in 1965. In 1965, it started mostly by Mexican and Filipino farm workers who were migrants, okay? Here's a few statistics. In 1965, 84% of farm workers were below the poverty level. 84%. We're talking deep poverty. Because they're migrants, they're homeless. Labor laws do not apply to them. There are specific exceptions written into labor laws saying farm workers are exempt from various regulations and protections. Life expectancy for a farm worker is 49 years. Child labor started as early as age 6. Okay? And as I mentioned yesterday, the United Farm Workers, it wasn't called that quite in 1965. It was called the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee. They merged with another organizing effort called the Agriculture Workers Organizing Committee. And they decided to strike at 48 farms. Okay? They had $82 in their bank account, and they had one employee, Cesar Chavez, leader. Actually, when they merged, I think they had 2 employees, Larry Itleong, who was a Filipino also. So this was extremely poor people and an extremely poor organization taking on a very well-funded and supported business, the California grape market, and particularly vineyards, makers of wine. Okay? So the first thing they did, obviously, there's the UFW symbol, is they tried to cut off the worker relationship. Okay? So their workers went on strike at 48 farms, formed pickets. But the laws made it very, very easy for the farm owners to bring in strike breakers. They brought in contract workers from Mexico, brought them in. They had no rights. They paid them very little, and then shipped them back to Mexico. Okay? So the first form of pressure the movement brought was withdrawing labor, but other labor was able to come in. And actually, in the fall of 1965, there was a record crop for these farmers. The farmers, or the growers they called them, had a record harvest and made a lot of money. So a strike alone was ineffective. At that point, the movement may have fizzled out. People were disappointed. But by my understanding of history, it was Cesar Chavez who said, actually, let's go talk to the dock workers, the people in shipping in Oakland and San Francisco. So they talked to the transportation unions, the longshoremen in Oakland and San Francisco, and actually got them to let the grapes sit out for 5 or 6 days before shipping them. Now, what happens if grapes sit out for 5 or 6 days? They go rotten. So sorry, we couldn't ship your grapes. Sorry, we just can't get to it. Oh, they went bad. So he tried and successfully got workers and other unions to do solidarity with them. But that still wasn't enough. This was a very, very powerful lobby and business interest in California. So the next thing they did is they tried a consumer boycott. And they started just by boycotting 2 different labels of wine, 2 different companies that make wine. And they were actually successful. Then they decided they wanted to launch a larger boycott against a few more labels. And then they decided they were going to go after the entire table grape market, not just wine now, just grapes that people buy. And they just went after a few companies. But what happened is there are lots of different grape growers in California, and they started switching up all their labels about who makes what. So they'd say, consumers, don't buy this brand, and then a new label would come out, and a new label would come out. So consumers got really confused. So in, what year was it, 67 or 68, they decided, oh my gosh, we're going to have to try to boycott every single grape that comes out of California. So they went after consumers. That wasn't enough. But consumers were starting to get receptive to their message. They used a lot of students. They used a lot of people in they shipped people all over the country. Students didn't pay them, basically, and pay them virtually nothing, sleeping in basements, whatever, to go out and boycott grapes. Then they started secondary boycotts of stores that sold these grapes. Then they went to distribution centers and tried to block food distribution centers from shipping these grapes. Now at this point, the farmers that were against the farm workers organized a PR campaign. They created false organizations to try to claim that this union was bad, blah, 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 blah. And they also had powerful allies in Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. At that point, Richard Nixon was president of the United States, and Ronald Reagan was governor of California. So Reagan, he starts denouncing these farm workers, and he called them barbarians, I think. And Nixon decides in 1968 the Pentagon is going to buy 6.9 million pounds of grapes. And in 1969, they bought 9.7 million pounds of grapes. He also, get this, he quintupled grape shipments to Vietnam. In 1968, 555,000 pounds of grapes were bought for soldiers in Vietnam. But by 1969, 2.4 million pounds of grapes were shipped to Vietnam, an average of 8 pounds per soldier. This was the effort to break this. Okay? And actually, the farm workers responded by this by starting to boycott at military institutions, saying, don't eat the grapes here. So what we see here, I will tell you, by the way, they won. In 1970, they unionized 85% of California grape vineyards. 20,000 workers were members of the UFW 5 years later, and 85% of the grape market. Okay. Now, what do we learn from this? What do we learn?
Pentagon has a lot of wine.
People are drinking a little too much. What else?
Using different tactics.
Okay. And yes, using different tactics is critically important, sustains the movement. What else?
It's important to kind of identify the support structure of organizations you're opposing.
Yes, to do the research and
Target different actors and different people involved
Yeah.
Well, nothing works without unity. I mean, unity is a key factor, as you've said from the very beginning.
What this shows me, and you're hitting on it, but I'll say it a little differently, is that targeting one relationship of a target may not be enough. Targeting several different relationships. A principle of strategy is simultaneous multiple pressure. And it applies at an individual scale or a large scale. I mean, if I'm having a bad day because I lost my wallet, that's bad. But if I'm having a bad day because I lost my wallet, I have the flu, and something terrible happens to someone else and I lose my job, I'm really in trouble. It's the same with corporations, it's the same with governments. When multiple relationships are disrupted, it becomes very, very difficult to function, especially for bureaucracies. So, just one thing to think about. Another thing that comes out of this, read this quote from Cesar Chavez. The whole essence of nonviolent action is getting a lot of people involved. Through tactical innovation, he got a lot of people involved. I could be part of the movement just by choosing not to buy something. It's difficult to get people involved in a picket line because it takes their time. But any time a person can be persuaded not to eat a grape, that's involvement, that's the most direct action, and it's set up in such a way that everybody can participate. So understanding that a movement has different levels of involvement and coming up with tactics for each level of involvement in a movement can be critical. Would also point out that a little bit of innovation can be a substitute for a lot of money. These guys didn't have a lot of money, but they had a lot of creativity in what they did. So speaking of creativity and getting people involved, I want to end by playing you a short video of our friend Yvonne in a very creative tactic.
Fear is together with apathy, the biggest enemy of social movement and the biggest ally of the regime. Humor is important to lower fear. Lowering fear is important to increase participation. We go into the street, we put like a big barrel in the middle of the street. And it's Milosevic's picture is on the barrel. And there is a texting money for Milosevic's retirement. Please insert the coin. And there was a baseball bat next to the barrel. And it said, if because of Milosevic's economic policies you don't have a coin, bang the barrel. After 15 minutes, there were 100 people around the barrel banging. Bam, bam, bam. And the police shows up. What's going on here? Whose barrel is this? Well, we don't know. After some time, they take the barrel, put it in the car, and take it away. We take the cameras, snap, snap, snap. Police arrested the barrel. This is the dilemma action. They don't touch the barrel, more people are coming and banging it. If they take it away, they look silly. there is no way out. Regret whatever you do. So this is the dilemma action. It's great, it's funny, you're having a good laugh, and what is more important, you are destroying the loyalty of, in this case, of the police force. The police force doesn't think that you are right, doesn't necessarily need to like the movement. But what this action creates is that they stop trusting in the wisdom of their leadership. Because the regime that puts them in the situation where they have to arrest Barrow, something is wrong here. Q&A? 15 more minutes though.
I want to make an observation, and it has to do with Yvonne's point about declaring victory. The context is very important. When Martin Luther King traveled to India, one of the things that surprised him the most was that there was no hatred for the British. Gandhi wanted the British to leave as friends. He wanted India to be able to trade with Britain. He didn't want animosity. He said, we don't want to be triumphal. There was no declaration of victory whatsoever. Martin Luther King said, we want to avoid the psychology of victors. Jim mentioned on the first night that the signs came down quietly. They disappeared. There was no press conference announcing, we won. Be very cautious about this declaration of victory business. It may not be appropriate for your movement. Your movement may instead want to smooth any effort to make an assertion of triumphalism, and instead prepare the way for a kind of seamless reconciliation.
Yeah, it's a great point. Okay, so
we'll start on this side. Got it then.
I'd just like to take this point a little further. I absolutely agree. It's not a declaration of victory, but sometimes you have to declare success for sustaining a movement. When people think that they have not achieved anything, it's frustrating, it's enraging, and it's sometimes counterproductive. It makes them more enraged. So every now and then you have to show the goals that have been attained, not with a sense of victory and being vindictive, but the fact that you have earned this, and this is what keeps a movement going at times.
Accomplishment is entirely different.
Yes.
Okay, wait, Mohammed, did you? Okay, Jen.
But the also issue is in almost all of our human situations and nations, the struggle must continue for generation after generation. And there are many ways to mark the accomplishment and to continue it. In the case of the movement of the campaign of Nashville 1961, we began the process of desegregation in downtown, highly effective, but we had to move from downtown to the limits of the town, where you had public buildings, restaurants, skating rinks, theaters, and so we turned our attention in our celebration of strength to the theaters. Then we turned it to the grocery stores and to jobs. So you had many accomplishments to achieve, and the victory campaign can easily in any community become a way of not doing the follow-up by which both the spiritual, moral, political aspects of the movement get entrenched.
Yeah, I would like to add one thing to that, maybe to clarify what I had in mind. Is that, you know, I said it before, the struggle goes on, but this sense of accomplishment, that you kind of are ready to go into the next stage and maybe change the mode of operation, all that stuff, is something that is totally in the control of the movement. Nobody else says we won. The movement is the one who can say we won or we didn't win, and it has certain repercussions. And that's why declaring victory is an important concept, not in the sense of triumphalism, but in the sense of like evaluating where we are and when is the time to stop. Because I've seen movements that didn't understand that the time is to stop, which means not to stop the struggle, but means to change the struggle, to change the form of struggle, and to change the actors. Because, you know, sometimes it's time for one generation to step aside and let the new generation come in and take over. These are the things that I had in mind. Because, you know, no movement will solve all the problems, but it is important that the movement understands that that it managed to reach a certain at a certain stage where things can change.
I would echo what Ivan's saying, but also what you're saying, because I don't, you know, I see it as a balance. I mean, to get people to mobilize, expectations must be raised. They must expect that they're going to be able to win something, or they're not coming out. They will demobilize themselves if they feel that they have failed. And so, and usually when people are demoralized from oppression anyway, they're just, the default setting was, oh, it failed, it failed, it failed. So there has to be someone to say, no, we did this. Your expectations, you know, we didn't meet all your expectations, but some of them were met, and if we continue, we will continue to meet them. So I mean, I see it as a balance. On the other hand, in cases it would be completely inappropriate to have a victory parade or, you know, big triumphant press releases. And the cases that you two mentioned both seem very consistent with that. Yeah. Okay. I'll go with Al, and then I want to go with participants. So we'll go Al, Nadia, Jensheng, Gray, Ayman, and Mohammed.
I don't see any inconsistency between what Gada said and what Mary said. They're talking about two different things. As you're along the road to your goal, you have to show your advances. I know people don't like terms like victory because they're from sports and war, but this also points to the biggest enemy of any social movement are experienced activists who think that there's only one way to do things, and they come in and they say, we've always done it this way, therefore we're going to do it this way. You have to have a constant influx of new blood, of people who have not been brainwashed in the art of activism. So, because these are also your Debbie Downers and your Nancy Negatives. No, these are your people who will call any amount of progress, it's not enough. It's not a victory. Oh, we only got health care for the first time in the United States, but it's not single payer, therefore it's a defeat. You've heard all these people before. These people are bigger enemies to any social movement than the intelligence services of the enemy. And what you constantly need is this new influx of people who are not formed in the traditional forms of activism. So because these people will know right away what a small victory along the path looks like. These people understand what progress looks like because they're not so jaded by their experience, and they're not infected by the disease of, I lose, therefore I am pure.
I'm sure that's going to get tweeted out. It's going to go viral.
He's talking about a political process and not an activist process. He's talking about the United States. And that's the United States. Activism is terrific, but it is not unified in a nonviolent, philosophical, tactical, strategic approach. So that's precisely what we see going on in the United States. But my point is that most of the countries here represented are countries that have a long journey from the status of where they are today, of domination and control, towards where they're going to have a society of genuine participation. We don't have that yet in the United States.
Okay. Actually, I said I'd go to you, but Mohammed had his hand up for a while. So let's go to Mohammed, and then we'll go around, and I'll get you on after.
Well, I have a comment and a question.
Okay.
The comment, I want to comment like on what Mary and Riyad has been saying. The example is from Gaza, actually, in 2008, 2009, when in the Castled operation, like Israel has been bombarding Gaza for 25 days, and more than 1,000 people got killed, and like thousands got injured. After the end of the war, Hamas came down the street celebrating the victory, which annoyed the people. There was no victory there. Because like Israel set up goals that they didn't achieve, Hamas considered that as a victory, while there was blood in the street and destructions. What victory are you talking about? That's an example. On the other hand, on March 15th, youth mobilized to reconciliation and to end this kind of division between West Bank and Gaza.
March 15th of this year.
This year, yes. Those guys went down the streets, like, I don't think that they followed the whole tactics and strategies like for that kind of movement. And in 2 weeks, like their efforts been scattered, and there was no real achievement on the ground. And a month ago, Hamas and Fatah made this agreement in Cairo for the reconciliation. No one can get a credit for that. Maybe March 15th, like mobilization was a reason that contributed, but they didn't announce victory. So I believe that it depends on the context, like how you can wanna say like yes to celebrate, declare victory, and or just to keep it moving. My question is, for the factors of success, unity, planning, nonviolent, discipline, I don't see like financing. And is it important? Yesterday's movie shows that the United States was financing the whole movement, and that kept going on. I want to compare this with the revolution in Egypt and in Libya. In Egypt, it was like a pure internal funding, where in Libya, the transitional government, while the revolution that keep going on in Libya, we saw the transitional government in Paris and celebrating and getting the credit from Sarkozy. Like, it means in other ways that there is a foreign aid that helped the NATO bombarding Libya, whatever. So I mean, like, if the money is important, and if so, how does foreign money affect the movement?
Well, I mean,
no, I want you to answer it, but I'm just thinking in terms of time, maybe we should take all the questions and then come to them.
Okay, I just
no, answer it, whatever you want. I just kind of think.
Okay, we started about 10 minutes later, so
okay, so we have time to
take another. Yeah, I'm going to be really brief. I don't think money is important. I mean, I don't think that financing is important in terms of getting foreign funding or whatever. I mean, the movement that is big, that has 100,000 activists, let's say. If each brings $1, that's $100,000. It's nothing for a particular activist, but for a whole movement, it's a huge sum. You know. So and Egypt proves the whole thing. This movie that you saw last night was made in the United States for the American audience. So Americans like to see how they make things happen. I mean, you have it in mind. It's a narrative. Exactly, it's a narrative. Nobody would show that movie on TV if it didn't. PBS wouldn't broadcast it if it didn't stress the American role in the whole thing. But was it? Did they help? Of course they did. But what was that? You know, the deal breaker? No, it wasn't. If it weren't for that sort of help, we will find other ways, because that's what movements do. Movements exploit opportunities. We found an opportunity which was this sort of funding, and we used it. If in some other circumstances we didn't have that, we would use some other opportunity. That's the whole idea of building a movement that can respond to these opportunities.
Can I just intervene here? I think in terms of external party support, particularly financial support, we have to take that in more relative terms. So we have to look at the financial resources available to Milosevic vis-a-vis financial resources available to the movement, which was probably quite insignificant. The same thing is also when people are saying that there was so much money coming to Ukraine. in order for Orange Revolution to take place and be successful. But no one looks at how much money actually was coming, was available to Kuchma government or Yanukovych government, and how much money was actually coming from Russia in support of the government to defend the government against the Orange Revolution. So if you treat that in relative terms, you've got a completely different picture.
Okay, so we have about 10 or 15 minutes, and I think maybe a process that could, 10, says Bill. So I think maybe a process that would work is letting people all comment, and then Ivan and I will comment at the end. Is that okay with you? Does that work? Okay, so next up was Nadia.
Okay, awesome. I have maybe a comment and two questions. I come from Bulgaria, so I've been watching what is going on in my neighbor country. So I would like to ask you, in the beginning, Odpor started as a student movement without any help in the country or outside, and very quickly mobilized hundreds and thousands of Serbians, not only from the universities, not only among young people. Vast majority of experts think and point out that Odpor was the main organization and that contributed a lot to the victory. Have you ever thought to form a political party because you were the most active part of the Serbian opposition, and people trusted to Odpor? They went on the street because they trusted you, not to political parties, although you had so many, I think 17 or 18 political parties from the opposition. So, and you could be able to win a lot of seats in the parliament. So what about your tactics? Have you ever thought to change your tactics and move to politics?
Yeah.
Because actually you have reached your goal very quickly in a very short period of time, whereas the opposition couldn't do that for 10 years.
Okay, exactly. That was our thinking after Milosevic fell down. We had the exactly same line of thinking as you have. It's like we were successful and everybody likes us, and we actually contributed to that. And so we did form a political party. And then we got 1.6% of votes. And we were like, how did this happen to us? We were shocked. We were shocked. Everybody loved us. Everybody was like clapping. Everybody was like, we were the heroes. And then we did a focus group to understand why people didn't vote for us. Everybody liked us. Nobody wanted to vote for us. And we did a focus group. And we asked people, why didn't you vote for us? And they said, we love you kids. You were great. But you know what? You were kids who were arrested. You're not politicians. You were kids, nice kids who were arrested. That's not the quality of a politician. And that taught us a very big lesson. It's one thing to be a community organizer. It's a completely different thing to be a politician. And, you know.
So don't try to.
We learned it the wrong way.
Okay.
The hard way.
Yeah.
I would like to introduce the decision-making structure of the 1989 movement in China and ask your comments. The most important step to involve almost all the classes in China in the movement in 1989, I believe, is the hunger strike of students. After that, students occupied Tiananmen Square. Many people surrounded the students who carried on hunger strike. A headquarters, a command center was created. The students there were very proud, and they began to experiment democracy. The decision-making process is something like the practice in ancient Greek. Yeah, one person, one vote. Yeah, every decision there is passed. Almost all important decision expressed in this way. One consequence of that process is that radicals were elected to the leadership. They control the movement, and actually the movement was out of control. Recently, I often think of this, the whole movement, and want to deal with it because it is a failure case. Would you please give some comments?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great example. I think that there, as Hardy said before, there is no recipe, but these are the important things to think about, especially when it comes to decision making. And the models that can be used for decision making vary from country to country, from situation to situation. But what essentially, to kind of movements are not so much about political issues. People in general don't care much about political issues in a political sense, as they care about their place in the community. So what movement needs to focus on is not debating politics so much, but actually allowing individual people to use the movement as the venue to express themselves. So if you can create a movement where people can express themselves, express not just their grievances, but also their creativity, then you don't need to care much about decision-making process or what kind of structure you're and how people are elected and all that stuff. If people feel that the movement is a place where they can express themselves, they're going to participate, because this is going to help them, become how shall I say, members of the community, and respected members of the community. So I always when talk about movement design, I always stress that political aspect of it, like debating political issues and what is going to happen, all this stuff, is fine. But for most people, it's their daily lives and their place in the community that matters more. And if the movement can offer them that movement is the one they're going to join.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said. Also, when you talk about movement organization, there's always a tension between a fluid movement, a movement that's decentralized, that can withstand repression because you can't arrest everyone because there's lots and lots of leaders and everyone's doing their own thing. But then if it comes time to negotiate, who negotiates, who claims representation? So it's very challenging. So you get these structured movements where they can actually present a negotiating person, and they can claim to represent people. And they can say, if we come to an agreement, then the people will stop mobilizing because I represent them. On the other hand, this more structured a movement is, sometimes the easier it is to repress. You take off the leadership and this and that. So this sort of tension between these two things, and what I think happens with some movements is that they go through phases. You go through a phase where it's really fluid, then a phase where they might see, okay, we might need to actually have some organizational structure that can be coherent here, and do that, and then go back, or maybe try to have both at the same time, so that they're not depending too much on an organization structure or too much on just a fluid, really decentralized movement. The other thing about Tiananmen, and you're the expert, not me, but before decisions are even made in terms of like a formal structure, there's the building up of an organizational culture. There's building up of the cause consciousness. And there's building up of principles of how we do things. So that the person who joins for the reason Ivan said, because he can express himself or she can express themselves, has a sense of what principles they govern how they express themselves. And all of that, if that's not done ahead of time, regardless of the kind of decision-making structure you develop, it may be very difficult. So just another thing to think about. Okay, next was Eamon. Eamon.
My question is, of course, it's very important to come up with tactics that sustain a movement.
Yeah.
But I believe that the question of social solidarity is a key factor and or play an important role in sustaining a movement. So I would like to ask, what are the tactics that promote or enhance social solidarity that sustains movement? For instance, if we talk about, or to highlight the situation back home in Palestine, for instance, we have a very diverse political parties. You know, like, let's talk about Hamas, Islamic Party, or Fatah, or Republic Front, or so many political parties, that we don't find social solidarity, you know, out of these political parties. You know, some political parties backed up by United States or European Union, others backed up by Iran, and so very much diverse. So we don't find that unity between these political parties that negatively reflects on the ground. So we found the entire Palestinian society is almost politicized. You know? So we need to come up, you know, this is how I believe, you know, that we need to come up with the unified national agenda, you know, which is pretty much should be focused on non-violence, for instance, as a means of liberation. You know? So again, my question is, how can we come up with tactics that promote social solidarity among such
especially with political parties? That
Yeah. Well, I mean, these are great points. I mean, I don't know how to do it, but it's exactly what needs to be done. I mean, I think that creating, actually looking at the movement, and I kind of touched on that, is like when I said the movement as a place where people can express themselves, but also looking at the struggle not just as a political struggle. Not just as something you have a political goal that you need to reach, and when you reach it, you're, you know, declare victory or don't declare victory or whatever. But you also see it as an opportunity for each individual to go through personal transformation. And this is something that, you know, when I look back at what we did in Serbia, is that like all levels of society, individuals in their neighborhoods, and as they joined the movement, as they participated, and even if they didn't join the movement, but when everything was over, they started like, yeah, I supported you from the very beginning, that kind of thing. That contributed to this personal transformation, that people accepted and embraced new values that they didn't embrace before. And not just that they embraced them, but they felt like if they always embraced them, if you see what I mean. And when I talked to Janet Cherry, who is our friend and colleague from South Africa, and she was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, she says that there were people who were, you know, not a small number of people who were supporting the apartheid, and they were supporting the whole racial segregation, like the Boers and white people. Sure. But after everything was over, they too went through this transformation, and they actually sincerely said this was bad, this was wrong, and I actually never really supported that. I was just, you know, faking the whole thing. So the whole society goes through this transformation. Even your adversary. So if you look at it like that, I mean, and if you plan tactics in the, specific tactics, but if you look at the movement as a vehicle that is going to lead the whole society through this transformation, that each individual is going to go to this transformation, you're going to establish this social cohesion, because these kind of bonds between different people are established in the time of great danger, and people are going to, for instance, I talked about this last night. Even today, you know, with all the distance that exists between me and my friends who are in the government now, there is this bond that we were together as part of the movement and spent some time in jail together and all that stuff. So there is something that creates this bond of the new society, despite all the political differences that we may have today.
Ivan, can I just ask you one thing as well? I mean, you had an opposition that was really fragmented in Serbia, and you had to deal with opposition parties that were bickering and claiming to represent the people that couldn't agree. And my sense is that other people are encountering that, and maybe that was even part of your question. Can you talk about how you did that in Serbia a little bit, how you dealt with that issue?
Well, I think we covered that last night, so I don't want to, I don't want to, you know, repeat the whole thing, because we did spend some time on that.